Now on this video I want to talk about the very important concept of succession in biology. Succession is how ecosystems start or deal with major disturbances that sometimes affect its quality or its diversity level. So ever wonder where life just shows up in a place? Like in Hawaii, for example, there's volcanic islands like the ones you see on the screen, which are constantly spewing lava and making new land. But if you go to Hawaii, which is really far in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, like far from any continent, you will find trees, you will find birds, you will find animals. How do they get there? How does that life develop in an island that wasn't even there before? Now, first of all, you might be able to understand that sometimes life is carried by the currents of the ocean from continents. Granted, it would be really hard to get that far in Hawaii just with the ocean currents, but it is possible that some seeds or some things like that will get there. In an island that's closer to a continent, it's feasible that even an animal can make it to an island like that. Birds also migrate across the world, and sometimes they see, hey, looks like a nice spot to take some rest. And they will carry with them seeds sometimes, and they will actually poop and have nutrients and they will actually poop too, which adds nutrients right next to the seed and helps start off the process. Sometimes seeds are also thrown by plants and caught by the wind, and then they get picked up by the global wind belts and taken far away from where they were. And if you don't believe that's possible, in Florida, 90% of the dust is Sahara Desert sand. So just think about that and realize that the atmosphere is a powerful conductor of small particles. And so between particles suspended in the atmosphere, between animals going in currents or other things going in currents, between things that actually live in the water, like algae and other microorganisms that could actually hit the beach and start populating the things like that if they have enough tolerance to live both in the water and in the land, or at least in the moist areas near the beach, in the intertidal zone. You also have the birds which are flying around. Between all of these things, life gets there, and believe it or not, it will start. But then you have another issue, like there is no soil. It's just pure rock. It's just basically volcanic material that's solidified to become rock. And without soil, you can't really have plants. So how can land life be established in those circumstances? Well, to the process of what we call primary succession. Now, before we talk about that, I want to remind you of something, of the idea of the competitive exclusion principle. And that's the idea that two species vying for the same habitat, for the same place, for the same role in the ecosystem, they will have to exclude each other out. Like we talked about this before in the community ecology lecture series. And the idea is that two organisms cannot occupy the same niche. But more often than not, organisms will have niches which are varied enough that they don't compete in every single circumstance, which allows them to coexist. Even if they do have areas where they compete with each other, and one, of course, wins, there are other areas where they don't, and that way they can survive together. And that's because animals' fundamental niche, which is how much it can tolerate, is often larger than its realized niche. And so animals get to exist in that. But if two organisms live exactly in the same niche, they will outcompete each other, and ultimately, and this is important because as succession is going to happen, and we're going to talk about that, there's going to be competition for niches going around, and eventually new species will replace species that were there before because of that. There's also the concept of pioneer species. Now, these are species which usually are selected species which have incredible fast reproduction rates and can live in very hostile environments, and they're going to be species that don't necessarily need soil to survive, and they were the first ones to colonize the land, basically. That includes things like moss, liverworts, and lichen. And we learn a little bit about that later in the year, but remember, we already talked about lichen. It's basically a symbiotic relationship between algae and fungus, and it lives in moist environments, or sometimes even drier environments. And then you also have moss, which lives in moist environments. And so near the beach, spores that were carried by the wind, or that were in the water, or microorganisms that live in the water but have tolerance to live in moist environments in the intertidal zone, will be the first ones to actually take over the land back when the land is nothing but pure rock that's moist. So understand then that the whole principle of succession is based on the idea that there are some species called pioneer species which are able to survive in those harsh environments. In fact, they love surviving in those harsh environments. And So here's how succession kind of works. You start with that exposed rock, and I'm following the bottom of here first, but you can look at any one of the pictures that I put over there. And those lichen and moss will start living there, and then they will break down the soil because, as they live there, they will literally help erode the soil. And the waves will also do their trick, and little by little, you're going to have more sand and more soil there. And then those lichens and moss, as they die, they become carcasses, and then the microorganisms, which are plenty available in the water and in the air, will fall on top of that, start decomposing them, and before you know it, there's nutrients on soil. But in the beginning, the soil is going to be very, very small. There's very, very little soil. So only the smallest of herbs and shrubs will be able to live in those circumstances. And usually it's going to be what we call annual plants. Plants that, have one spurt to life, and they will spread seeds all over the place. And these are usually the seeds that come from somewhere else in the air. You also then start building bigger and bigger plants. And as these plants are starting to become more shrub-like, more perennial plants that come every season or so. And now the soil is also getting thicker because, remember, there's more and more species dying off and being decomposed. Now you're able to sustain larger and larger species, but that means the smaller lichens and moss and herbs will have trouble making it now because the bigger species are outcompeting them for the sunlight, for the nutrients. This process will continue, and little by little, larger and larger plants will take their place, and eventually they will outcompete the smaller ones, which can't reach the sunlight as fast, and will outcompete for the nutrients as well. And only a small amount of shrubs and smaller herbs will stay behind the large, tall trees. And this is a process that takes some time to happen, but it's faster than you actually think it does. In some cases, it can happen within a matter of, a decade. The ecosystem can change completely. Of course, it will take much longer than that for the really, really tall trees to get as tall as they could possibly get. But basically, you start with no soil, and then the pioneer species like lichens and liverworts and mosses and will start to grow, and then you're going to get small herbs and grasses and small plants, and then you're going to get ferns and brackens and shrubs, and then larger shrubs, and then smaller trees, and then before you know it, you have big, big trees, and finally you might even get the ginormous oak trees, which live for a very, very long time. That is primary succession, and it's primary succession because there was no life there before. There was not even soil there before. There was never been life there before. So that's called primary because it's the first time life has conquered that ecosystem. Now, one thing that's also important to talk about here is that very last community, the community that's like the one the ecosystem is supposed to really be the maximal potential for its completion, is called the climax community. So you go from pioneer species to climax community, and in between, several species are helping each other out. Like the liverworts and mosses were facilitators because they were the ones that created the soil for the other ones to come afterwards. So each new species is based on the step of the one before. So they're facilitators. There's also a little bit of inhibition as you go along this because the new taller species inhibit the growth of the smaller ones. And sometimes the smaller species will also inhibit the growth of the taller species because they are already settled, and so it's going to be harder for the seeds of the taller species to make it there. By the way, you might be asking yourself, where are those seeds coming from? Again, remember, birds, wind, water can carry those things. They don't have to develop there. It's not like the ecosystem is evolving all of this. It can come from somewhere else where a similar environment or temperature or biotic conditions have, and the wind just happens to carry the pollen or whatever to the place. So life finds a way, basically. And a lot of times also there's a little bit of tolerance in succession because when you get to the climax community, you don't completely destroy some of the things that were there in the beginning. There's still going to be some small herbs and things like that in the middle, below the trees, but that's going to be the majority. So, and you may ask yourself, it kind of sucks for the first species that come through. They just get outcompeted eventually. But no, that's how they make their lives. They live there and they do their job there, and then they spread their seeds in the environment, and then their seeds are carried by water and wind and end up somewhere else where they repeat the process. And that's how they live. They live by pioneering each ecosystem that's available for that. And so it's not like when they're replaced, it's the end of that species. Their seeds are out there already. While they were living there, they made plenty of seeds which now can go to colonize new land somewhere else. And so that's how the pioneer species make it in the world. Likewise, each successive species goes through the same process. And so succession is an example of life going from one place to another. It's not really the origin of life. It's just basically life that succeeded in a place, and then it gets replaced, spreading and going somewhere else to do exactly the same. And this happens in sections. And each step of the way, you're going to need something to transfer that life to the island to replace it. But there's plenty of ways, like we talked about in the beginning of the video, for that to happen.